Thank you very much. This is very an exciting moment for me because I've been visiting the CCA for now many years, since really 2009. So the CCA, I have to say thank you very much for always being very generous and accommodating to my excessive demands, I think, probably. But maybe that's a little bit of a reflection on Cedric as both a person. It's evidenced in the weight of what is here, which is a slightly lighter version of the archive downstairs. So it's an important moment for me. Some people call it closure, but I think it's probably maybe opening. I don't know. I hope somehow. We'll open this later on. But as Kim said, I have been asked specifically to talk about talks and articles, which in my world is volume 2. Volume 1 is projects, so that's that much, and then volume 2 is that much, which is talks and articles. So when we talk about Cedric and words, we need to talk about talking, conversations, discussions, debates in a political sense, spoken word as a means to explore an idea, performance and props. We also need to talk about words in print, novels, reviews, commentary, columns, papers, projects, reports and studies. And we need to talk about words on drawings, naming of projects, annotation and speech bubbles. So in the next few minutes or several minutes, I will try to cover all of these, often a little bit like Price, skipping from one to another and back again. But I'll try to touch on as many as I can and work this also. So I started the introduction of this volume 2 thus, with a quote from Charles Dickens' Pickwick Papers, written in 1836. "A gentleman inquires of Mr. Pickwick, 'Philosopher, sir?' And Pickwick replies, 'An observer of human nature, sir.'" The Pickwick Papers' central character, Samuel Pickwick, was something of a hero of Cedric's, who had 16 copies of the book in his library, in addition to the one he kept especially for travelling, of what was Dickens' first novel. Dickens had been a political reporter and roving journalist, and he was about 24 when he wrote this first book. And his central character, Pickwick, was the founder and lifelong president of the Pickwick Club. He and his friends, Mr. Winkle, Mr. Snodgrass and Mr. Tupman, would travel by coach to places throughout rural England, recording what they called the manners and life of the country, and report on their findings to the other members of the club, back in a pub somewhere in the city in London. It provides, it provides the book. It provides a particularly excellent account of the coaching routes and inns of England at that time. But just as Pickwick roamed, Price also founded his own club. It was the enigmatically called Hot Stuff Club, which I may or may not talk about, but you can read about it in the book. But he also travelled continuously through the streets of his patch of London, between Marylebone and Bloomsbury, as well as further afield by train, plane and helicopter across England, Europe, the US, Asia and Australia, talking to clients, students, judging prizes, delivering lectures and papers at conferences. There's a little excerpt of a young Cedric Price talking at, I think, Nottingham, which they published, the students published in their magazine, recorded in the early 60s. His own account, Cedric's own accounts ledger shows that on average he made at least 2 public appearances a month, and often many more, which not only fueled his thinking and served as a marketing tool, it also supplemented the office income. While Price never relished long-distance travel, he did delight in meeting people. His observations in these encounters were recorded in his notebooks, many notebooks, and onto 3 by 5-inch note cards that he used to structure his future talks, and were also collaged into scrapbook pages that would form the basis of many magazine articles and columns. This is an example. I'm sorry, it's very tiny for you at the back, but this is a double-page spread from the magazine Architectural Design in 1970. Cedric had made a trip to the US and would send, he would collage the pages together and send them back to architectural design to then publish. So they were sort of reportage pieces, bits of newspaper article, people he'd met, that sort of thing, his observations. Price's, I'll talk a little bit more about that later in terms of where else he used that sort of source material in his talks. Price's activities as a writer and public speaker were all part of what he considered his usefulness, or not, as an architect. This broader conception of his role prompted the description of him as an architect thinker, a designation that came across as something of an oxymoron. A thinking British architect from the 1960s, whatever next. Yet this is precisely what Cedric was. One could even add the appellations learner for the ways in which he very explicitly sought to understand any given situation, and humanist, as he always strove to put people before place. As Price himself once remarked, "I have a soft spot for human beings." The dialogue between these responsibilities runs throughout Price's work, through the talks and articles and into the drawings and project making, and typically reveals itself through his allegiance to a kind of perpetual uncertainty or doubt in relation to society, culture, and the city. The incomplete, loose arrangement of these systems was something that he looked to organize by means of architecture. That's his own phrase. Words, spoken, written, or printed, were therefore an intrinsic part of Price's design mode, as the many cartoons, sketches, diagrams, and working drawings produced in the pursuit of each of his architectural projects. Again, a quite tiny, but probably a true representation. This is a sketch about that big, so maybe from back there it's about the right size. In the project work itself, text and pictures frequently collide, the words often being overlaid in the form of annotations, notes to self or to an office member, or captions again in the style of the cartoon, adding a comment or statement where the lines of a drawing alone are not enough. In this way, speech bubbles on drawings transform cartoon figures or built structures into sentient, thoughtful beings and encourage the viewer to understand the architecture as something dynamic, something capable of responding to the changing needs or desires of its users. Price noted on more than one occasion that it is the ability to change one's mind that makes us human, and this theme is central to his explorations in architecture. Indeed, it is a fundamental principle of his theory of an anticipatory architecture. In this Turtland project of 1990, just pre-internet era, imagine that, Price imagines a remote hill town village in former Yugoslavia to be crowned by an electronic halo of servicing that preserves the ancient fabric of the town, but enables it to be connected to the rest of the world, and in such a way that the technology can be replaced as and when updated, and this much he knew was coming. His mode of representation is not typically visionary or futuristic, but rather wholly humanistic. So this is a section of that halo, which is all the electronic gubbins and has its own thought mind. Where and when the house needs me, is what it says, with the little people underneath wondering when that is. Similarly, but in a different way, this drawing called Too Much Architecture is an extract of a dialogue between architect and employee. In this case, Keiichi Seiki, who worked in the office during the 1990s on his magnet project. The drawing on the left is the drawing done by Keiichi and left overnight. So Cedric comes in very early in the morning and looks at the drawings left in the office, and he puts a tracing over the top and makes his comments. So he makes a comment saying, "Lovely sketch, but too much architecture." So Keiichi gets ready to work the next day. Rubber stamps. That's a sort of plan view of a box of rubber stamps. The naming of projects. Each one of those has a different name of a project. I'm sure they're very dinky, these slides. The naming of project is a distinct trademark of Price's work, and with each new job, as it reached the office job list, it was rewarded with a new rubber stamp of the said project name. Often, anacronyms, not acronyms, but anacronyms, where parts of words are stuck together to form a new word, a tradition often used by the trade unions to name a new subcommittee, for instance. Cedric was very close to many members of the trade unions, particularly the trade union leaders at the time, which I dare say McApee will raise once more. But that way of naming is clearly borrowed in some way from that world, that political world. The method of creating a new name was used expressly by Price to create a conceptual abyss from what had gone before, and thus invite new design invention. For example, the Potteries Think Belt could not have just been a university in Staffordshire. The Fun Palace, neither a university or a theatre. McApee, not simply a tidying up of a construction site. Those names, those new words, Price demanded be loaded with so much more. Just to go back to the ever presence of dialogue, another example of Price's desire for exchange of ideas can be found in a series of lunchtime lectures that Price delivered in the AA bar, the AA school, the Architectural Association, in the early 90s. Now, these were not recorded, so these are my own, from my own, relating my own experience. I just recalled them as one of those moments that one could sort of almost forget happened, but typically of Cedric about 10 years later, you thought, oh yes, I was in the bar and he was talking. So Cedric would show up in the bar at 1 o'clock and start to talk. No one was expected to stop or be quiet, and they weren't. Rather, lunch service carried on as usual, and the lectures served as a kind of soundtrack to that part of the day. And so above the collective chat, Price's voice could be heard providing a kind of running commentary, an architecture a cappella, on a variety of current topics and events. Those lucky enough to be passing through picked up as much or as little as was useful to them. So eating, drinking, talking and thinking was just the way Price liked it. His pre-recorded slot for AATV, shown here, this is a still from that recording, serves as another good example of his quest for engaging with new audiences and in new ways. This was a short 19-minute recording, which is, I think you can now see it on YouTube. It's in the Architectural Association library, which was a pre-recorded slot of Cedric talking about architectural magazines that he liked to read. The titles of his talks conjure the promise that anything could happen, or you weren't entirely sure what you were going to hear, and equally do not preclude a strictly architectural audience necessarily. Some of the titles: Summertime Breeze, Autumn Always Gets Me Badly, Aiming to Miss, Technology is the Answer, but What Was the Question? Crystal Balls, Speculations into the Immediate Future. These are just a few. Again, you can see a lot of them on YouTube now. You're very lucky. A convivial ambience then, but make no mistake, Price's expertise in holding court, in commanding the attention of a room, was second to none. Central to his success, as any performer will know, was precision and timing, deployed more often than not with great comic effect. You will see throughout, certainly this volume too, the editorial parentheses, square brackets, laughter in italics, appear again and again in transcripts of lectures. And it was largely through these jokes and witticisms that Price was able to exercise and aerate the minds of his audience. In architectural design, timing was applied directly to problem solving in relation to movement and logistics. But in the context of the lecture space, it was used to keep the audience guessing as to what could possibly be coming next. What is coming next? There we go. The transcripts included in Volume 2 are not taken from the lunchtime performances. As I said, they were unrecorded. but they are from more conventional, yet never dull, occasions on which he spoke. Mostly in the dark, which is why you'll see in a moment in the graphic representation we chose to print white onto black. So the pages are black for the lectures to connote darkness, which is often what one was sitting in order to see the slides. We couldn't sit in a room like this where slides would have been diluted. So it was dark. So the space is dark and the pages are dark. And he spoke to an assembled audience from behind a lectern and usually alongside a slide screen. Talks were delivered in the belief that his words cheerfulness is next to usefulness, and largely took the form of loosely related observations, references and anecdotes, not unlike his hero Pickwick. Taken together, the talks give an indication of the rhetorical positions the medium afforded him, from exchanging views or intensely debating prevalent architectural preoccupations, both his own and those of others, to more manifesto-like tracts on his design thinking. Perhaps less conventionally, Price would stand and deliver his words, accompanied by the obligatory cigar and glass of brandy, which were not so much props as visible forms of punctuation. On occasion, he would include musical interludes, for example, Take 5 by MJQ or Ravel's Bolero, In Autumn Gets Me Badly, or add for more drama and perhaps more idiosyncratic accompaniments like a pumpkin on the lectern or a bowl of custard, pink custard, which was a particular prop for a talk in Folkestone in 1966 at the IDEA conference, that serving as a model of a city. Asked if, hang on, I'm going to have a glass of water. Asked if he enjoyed going to the theatre, Price once replied that he could not see the point of it. People all sitting facing the same direction, watching a foregone conclusion. The description does not apply to Price's own performance, neither his architecture. What his audiences were exposed to and what Price was attempting to conjure was a form of intense scholarly architectural edutainment, designed to make the listeners work as hard as the speaker and enjoy that work. The structure of many of the talks, and in this they remain quite distinct from lectures, hinges on a number of, as I've said, observations to be made around a certain theme, relying and reporting on seemingly unrelated events, both current and historical. So these are just some pages, so you can see how they're represented in the volume, this white on black. And then I'm going to click forward, and then slides, how slides were interlocked and very much part of the dialogue, not images shown separately, but slotted into that the speaking process. They're very small, so you can't really see. So I pulled out a few just so that hopefully you can see a little more clearly the very kind of eclectic choice of slides to represent a number of different ideas. Here clearly he's talking about, he was talking about the roles of women in the home, but also technology and the use, how it's been applied seemingly to replace women possibly in the home. Cartoons, images from fashion magazines, technology magazines, more cartoons, his own diagrams, sometimes referring to his own projects. I pulled out a few here also about often a lot of mobile vehicles and equipment. The one on the bottom left is an enormous piece of an oil rig that's submerged. So he was fascinated by enormous structures that could move and that were designed to move, even for a moment, in relation to architecture. And then again, more cartoons. So this just gives you a little idea of how they're shown in the book. Often the talks had no obvious beginning or end, and frequently generated, his word, not degenerated, generated into audience discussion, or were conceived in parts, so as to go to work through different phases of thought. For instance, ArtNet, there's a whole series of talks at ArtNet that do just that. In reading the transcripts of the talks, then, a reader will encounter certain touchstone quotes or ideas that are repeated across different events. So no, it's not deliberate that we repeat Cedric's. There is some repetition that goes throughout that volume. In his words, it was the necessary repetition for the willfully inattentive. And I know that feeling. It was his Price's way of putting it. Also, he's not easy, Price. He's difficult to read. He's difficult to listen to. And you often have to listen again and again and again and look again and again and again to actually get a grip of what's going on. So it's useful. He once noted that the translation from spoken word to the written word destroys immediacy. But he does concede that it also enables reference. So we're all okay. We're not betraying the ideas by doing this. Sometimes specific details from an office project were used to illustrate a more general idea, but Price refused to offer a standard sales pitch about the work of the office in the manner that is sadly sort of becoming more prevalent, or has become more prevalent, in architectural talks. In this sense, in his discussion with students, colleagues, clients, strangers, and himself, Price constantly sought to challenge the most commonly held understandings of what architecture might be. The medium, I'm going to move on briefly. I haven't kept time, so you've got to, will you give me, am I running horribly? Am I all right? Tell me how, 5, 4, okay, 2, okay. I'll try and be quick, but clear. Projects presented in the form of magazine articles, such as Pop-Up Parliament, Pottery's Think Belt, and Non-Plan, an Experiment in Freedom, all published in New Society in the first decade of Price's practice, a magazine expressly for the social sciences. These are all propositional and polemical in their form and content. In this case, the medium of a non-architectural periodical was expressly used to stimulate a more pluralistic, politically and socially engaged architectural discourse. Pottery's Think Belt, so Pop-Up Parliament, Pottery's Think Belt, and Non-Plan all appeared in New Society first. And then Pottery's was latterly published in the Architectural Press, in Architectural Design, with quite a different article, a modified article directed more specifically to architects, both critically and with regards to the selection of drawings. You can already see by the covers the New Society was a map, and architectural design tries to make it a more spatial drawing. Price's guest-edited issue of Architectural Design in May 1968, that most potent month and year in the calendar, What About Learning? Learning being his preferred word for education. Didn't like the word education. It shows him drawing together contributors from around the world to explore this theme and expanding his work on Detroit Think Grid in the US, which I think we're going to hear a bit more about, which was a byproduct of Think Belt. And in extreme contrast, the episodic 5-part CP supplement series, also presented in Architectural Design between 1970 and 71, which is a tour de force of forward-minded retrospection. Handy title for a book. A catalogue of projects from the office of Cedric Price Architects, written by Price and presented as sort of quasi-office worksheets. I'm sorry, they're sideways because that's the way you would see them as you open, but then the idea was you turn them round. So on the top, that box is a sort of little introduction to the project, a few selected images, and then the print in red is then Cedric's postscript, sort of self-analysis of that project, whether it was useful or not. And they do remain some of the most insightful documents to his approach to design. The earliest projects, represented by just 1 or 2 images, highly, highly edited, but always inviting, quite often the projects that were current in the office at that time, he would invite comments from readers. So he was always reaching out to his audience for some kind of interaction. That was the cover for the first supplement. which shows a picture of Price inflating his own stomach. Always one to poke fun at himself first, before anyone else was allowed the pleasure. It's a likely reference, I'd say, in some way to his inflated ego and enthusiasm for PR, whilst also a pun on his expertise in lightweight enclosures, which I think we're also going to hear a bit more about. And another cover, again, of the Polyarch project, showing the Polyarch project, a live project where architecture students were sent around the country in a double-decker bus, seeking exchange and work with other design students. So this was really a way of Cedric, again, publicising the project more than anything else. A shift in the early 70s meant that architectural design no longer was quite the architectural magazine it once was. Monica Pidgeon, its editor, moved on to the RIBA Journal in 75, and Price also moved on to appearing or writing more frequently for trade magazines and writing reportage pieces. So we see a few of, I'm nearly there. I'm mindful, I'm on the last page, don't panic. Price lists were one of them, price probes, price cuts. They offered informed criticism on current events, whether an RIBA conference or a government white paper. Price's writings draw on an intimate knowledge of the key political and institutional decision makers. Some of them were his clients, and their dealings, expressed very much in the modern tradition of the political columnist. The pieces are short, satirical, and of the moment. Sometimes he even plays the agony aunt. He collides detail so as to present a new angle on the familiar, sometimes so cryptically, it's really quite hard to understand anything at all. If you ever try to read any of these, they're packed full of names and nicknames of other people and current political figures of the time, so they take some decoding. But there's a fantastic scholar, Jim New, who's also worked in the archive, who's starting or working on quite a lot of that decoding for another generation, so to watch out for him. But he was devoted to, this new column, Price List, was devoted to what he called lists of such apparently disparate items which, with a proportion of the intelligence common to my readers, can be seen to produce a key to our padlocked profession. So he was always trying to find ways to bring current debate and current situation and event into architecture to try to open it up. So I'm very close now. Whether spoken or written, what is common to all of Price's words across more than half a century of their production is the conversational edge over which they hover. Price writes as he talks and vice versa. And his lunchtime addresses showed that he never really spoke alone. He was always heard amid considerable background noise. Although so utterly singular in his being, his practice in all modes is entirely polyvocal, a generous overlaying of voices and views. And that, at this point, I should also mention the role of his many editors. There's another version of scrapbook articles. Yeah, his many editors, which is another whole subject in itself. This drawing shows, it was in the frontispiece of Works 2, which was the sort of first published work of Cedric's work in 1984, more of a catalogue really. And it's a kind of diagram that Cedric drew of all the people and places that were involved in the making of that book. One of my favourite comments by him was in conversation when I once asked him why he sought out so many different kinds of people to work with on any given project. And he said, it's important to know when one is sufficiently incomplete. So I think that's a sort of diagram that shows that, takes more than one. So that's, in my view, a most useful and relevant point of reference when looking at and reading the work of Price today. His was not a universal theory of architecture. He did not proclaim a design dogma. Rather, he offers you a version of the world in its most authentically incomplete form, for you then as reader, listener or designer to pick up the pieces, the manners of life, as Pickwick called them, that are most useful to you at any given time, and to run with them. So good luck.